You know that helpless feeling when someone you love is in trouble and you can't do anything about it? Now imagine getting a call from your elderly mother, her voice shaking, as she tells you that the HOA has just destroyed her home. That's exactly what happened to me, but what they didn't know was that they had just picked a fight with the wrong person. I wasn't just some homeowner who would roll over and accept their abuse. I was the mayor, and I had the power to make them regret everything they had done. But how far would you go to fight back when you hold the keys to an entire city? It all started with my mother receiving a single violation notice, then another, then more, until she had an entire stack of them, each one threatening fines and legal action. She had lived in the same house for 40 years, a cozy two-story home that my father had built with his own hands. The garden was her pride and joy, filled with flowers she had nurtured for decades, and the wind chimes my father had made still hung from the porch, catching the afternoon breeze. But none of that mattered to Karen Whitfield, the new HOA president. She measured her power in how much control she could exert over others, and my mother had become her latest target. I first saw Karen prowling around my mother's yard one Sunday morning, ruler in hand, snapping pictures with her phone. I had just stopped by to drop off groceries when she turned and gave my mother a smug look. "These roses are too high," she declared, tapping the ruler against one of the bushes. "They exceed the approved height by 3 inches. Then she gestured toward the wind chimes, her lips curling in distaste. "And these decorations? They're not on the approved list." I felt my blood boil, but before I could say a word, my mother gently squeezed my arm, whispering that it was okay, that I shouldn't make trouble because of my position as mayor. That was just like her, always thinking of others, even when someone was harassing her on her own property. I should have fought back right then, but I didn't. I nodded, got in my car, and drove away, assuming it would all blow over. I had no idea this was just the beginning. Within days, the violation notices started arriving at an alarming rate. First, it was the roses, then the wind chimes. Then they claimed her mailbox was the wrong color. Then the birds at her feeder were a problem. Each notice came with a fine, and each fine was bigger than the last. I tried reasoning with Karen at the HOA meeting, explaining that my mother's home had been here long before these regulations existed, but Karen only gave me a fake smile and said that rules were rules. The way she emphasized my title made it clear she was daring me to intervene. I clenched my jaw and walked away, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Karen wanted my mother out, and I needed to find out why before it was too late. I'll never forget the morning I saw Karen standing in front of my mother's house, taking pictures with her tablet while talking on the phone. My stomach tightened as I heard her say, "Yes, this is the property I mentioned. It's perfect for the new development." She flinched when she realized I was watching, quickly hanging up and putting on her fake smile. That evening, I sat at my mother's kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching her hands shake as she showed me a growing stack of violation notices. 37 in just 2 weeks, she whispered, her voice breaking. "They're even complaining about the bird feeder your father built." That wooden feeder had been in our backyard for 25 years, bringing cardinals and blue jays to brighten my mother's mornings since my father passed. I knew this wasn't just about minor infractions. This was targeted. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, not as the mayor, but as a concerned son. The community center was packed, but the moment I walked in, the room fell silent. Karen sat at the head of the table, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her laptop. "Mayor Thompson," she said, her voice oozing with mock politeness. "How nice of you to finally join us." The meeting began as usual, discussing community pool hours and fence colors. But then Sarah Chun, my childhood friend and now a city council member, slipped me a note. "Check item 7 on the agenda." When Karen reached it, my blood ran cold. "Proposal for Community Enhancement Project, Partnership with Golden Parking Solutions." She clicked through a sleek presentation, showing a proposed parking facility meant to serve the growing community. The plan location? A group of underperforming properties that just happened to include my mother's house. The slides displayed digital renderings of a gleaming parking structure, complete with retail shops and revenue streams. I raised my hand, keeping my expression neutral despite the anger burning in my chest. "Miss Whitfield, have the affected homeowners been consulted about this proposal?" The room tensed. Karen's smile never wavered as she replied, "The HOA board is empowered to make decisions for the greater good of the community. Your mother's quaint property style is, unfortunately, bringing down neighborhood values." After the meeting, Sarah pulled me aside, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "There's more," she whispered. "I've seen Karen meeting with representatives from Golden Parking Solutions 3 times this month. They're not just planning a parking lot. They're talking about a full commercial complex." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat with my laptop, combing through city records, property maps, and HOA bylaws. Something didn't add up. The HOA had specific boundaries, and my mother's property was right on the edge. I needed more proof, but Karen had already blocked my official request for HOA documents, citing a conflict of interest due to my position as mayor. The next morning, I took matters into my own hands. I hired a private investigator to look into Golden Parking Solutions. That same afternoon, I visited my mother, only to find her in tears once again. Karen had sent 2 property inspectors to photograph every inch of her home, documenting so-called violations. The rose bushes my father had planted for their anniversary had been marked with orange tape for immediate removal. I was about to leave when something caught my attention through the kitchen window. Karen was in her backyard, having what looked like a heated argument with a man in an expensive suit. I took out my phone, zooming in to take a picture. The man turned, and I nearly dropped my phone. It was James Whitfield, Karen's husband. But why was he meeting with her in secret instead of at the HOA office? I had a feeling I was about to uncover something much bigger than just an unfair HOA president. I was sipping my morning coffee when my phone buzzed, an unknown number flashing on the screen. Mayor Thompson, the voice on the other end said, "You're going to want to see this." It was my investigator. He sent me a file, and as I opened it, my stomach twisted. Golden Parking Solutions wasn't just any company. It was a subsidiary of Whitfield Development Corporation. Karen's husband was the CEO. The entire scheme suddenly made sense. The harassment, the constant fines, the sudden push for redevelopment. This wasn't about community improvement. This was about money, and Karen had been using her power to drive homeowners out so her husband's company could cash in. My hands tightened around my phone. I had just uncovered corruption at the highest level of the HOA, and Karen had no idea I was onto her. As I walked to my car later that evening, Karen's voice rang out from behind me. "Mayor Thompson, I hope you're not planning to make this personal. After all, business is business." I turned slowly, meeting her gaze. "You're right, Karen. Business is business, and you have no idea who you're dealing with." I drove home, my mind racing with a plan. But before I could act, everything spiraled out of control. The next morning, I woke up to 15 missed calls from my mother. My heart pounded as I finally answered. "Sweetie, there are big yellow machines outside." Her voice was barely a whisper. "They're tearing up my garden, my roses. They're crushing everything." My blood ran cold. I grabbed my laptop, rushing out of my office. "Mom, stay inside. I'm calling the police right now." But as I listened through the phone, the sounds of destruction made my stomach twist. The crash of breaking wood. My mother's terrified scream. The rumble of heavy machinery getting closer. "They say I have 10 minutes to get out," my mother sobbed. "Karen is here with some men in suits. They're saying something about structural problems and emergency orders, but they won't listen to me." I called Karen's phone, straight to voicemail. I called the HOA office. No answer. I even tried my lawyer, but it was early Sunday morning. Every second felt like torture. "Mom, grab your medicine and the family photos. Don't argue. Just do it." My childhood friend Sarah picked up her phone, her voice tight with urgency. "I'm already here," she said. "It's bad. Really bad. They've got 3 bulldozers, and Karen is drinking champagne on her porch like she's watching a show. Your mom needs to leave now." I heard glass shatter through the phone. Mom was crying harder now. "The photos, there are too many. Sarah's trying to help, but they won't give us more time." I felt sick. "Leave them," I ordered. "Just get out. Please, Mom, get out now." The next few minutes blurred into a frenzy of phone calls, to the governor's office, to every media outlet, to my emergency response team. But it was like screaming into a void. By the time I got through to anyone with real power, it was too late. I watched it unfold through Sarah's live stream. My childhood home, the place where I had grown up, where my father had built our life together, reduced to nothing but rubble. Karen stood there the entire time, sipping her champagne, that smug smile never leaving her face, while my mother sobbed in Sarah's arms. She thought she had won. She thought she had broken us. But what she didn't know was that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The moment my plane landed 6 hours later, I drove straight to Sarah's house where my mother was staying. She looked so small, curled up on the couch, holding on to Dad's folded flag and her medicine bag, the only thing she managed to save. Her hands trembled as I sat beside her. I tried to stop them, she whispered, her voice shaking. I kept telling you the mayor, but Karen just laughed. She said, not in this neighborhood, she isn't. I felt a rage unlike anything I had ever known. Karen thought she had won, that she had crushed my mother, but she had no idea what she had just started. I stayed by my mother's side until she fell asleep, but my mind was already racing with what I needed to do next. That's when I noticed something peeking out from her coat pocket. A crumpled violation notice, but something about it was wrong. The date didn't match the other notices, and Karen's signature looked different. I grabbed my phone and took pictures. Maybe Karen wasn't as careful with her paperwork as she thought. Maybe this was the thread that would unravel her entire scheme. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept hearing my mother's sobs, kept seeing Karen's smug face as she watched the destruction unfold like it was entertainment. At 3 in the morning, I had enough. My hands shook as I pulled up city property records on my laptop. Something about that demolition didn't feel right. Even an HOA couldn't move that fast without proper permits. Sarah had taught me to trust my instincts during my first year as mayor, and right now, my gut was screaming that Karen had made a mistake. I called Sarah, not caring about the time. I need access to the old property maps, I said the moment she picked up, her voice groggy with sleep. The ones from before the HOA was even established. 20 minutes later, she was at my door, her laptop in hand, her eyes filled with the same determination I felt. We spread everything out on my kitchen table while my mother slept nearby, exhausted from the trauma. Look at this, Sarah whispered, pointing to a faded line on an old survey map. The original property lines put your mom's front yard outside the HOA's jurisdiction by exactly 3.5 feet. My pulse quickened. And where did they start the demolition? I asked, already knowing the answer. Sarah pulled up the photos I had taken earlier. Right at the front steps. But that wasn't all. As we dug deeper into the permit records, something even bigger jumped out. Golden Parking Solutions wasn't just any company. It was owned by Thomas Whitfield, Karen's husband. The same company that had been given an exclusive contract for the demolition and the parking lot construction. A deal worth millions. Before I could even process the full weight of what I had just uncovered, my phone buzzed with a text from Mike Reynolds, my old college roommate, who now worked at a major news station. Check your email, it read. You need to see this. I opened the attachment, my hands tightening into fists. Security footage from last week showed Karen and her husband meeting with the demolition company behind the community center, exchanging what looked like envelopes. The sun was just beginning to rise as Sarah and I finished connecting all the pieces. Karen hadn't just bulldozed my mother's home. She had orchestrated an entire scheme, one built on illegal actions, fraudulent documents, and backdoor deals. And in her arrogance, she had left behind more than enough evidence to take her down. I made my mother her favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes with extra syrup, and told her to trust me. Then I picked up my phone and started making calls. It was time to take Karen down. That afternoon, I walked into the HOA office, calm on the outside but seething on the inside. I had spent the morning assembling every piece of evidence, every document, and every legal loophole Karen had ignored. Now, it was time to confront her. The receptionist barely looked up when I asked to see the demolition permits. She stammered something about them being in process. I just smiled, remembering my father's advice. Keep your friends close and your evidence closer. Just then, Karen walked in, that same arrogant smirk on her face. Mayor Thompson, what a surprise. Coming to terms with progress? She asked, gesturing toward the rubble of my mother's home, still visible through the office window. I watched her carefully as I placed a single photo on her desk. The security footage of her and her husband meeting with the demolition crew, exchanging envelopes. The smirk vanished from her face in an instant. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, reaching for the picture. I pulled it back, placing more files in front of her. Property maps, fraudulent violation notices, permit violations, and the contract between Golden Parking Solutions and the HOA. "You know, Karen, my father always said the best revenge is serving justice with a side of karma." The color drained from her face as she realized how much I had found. She reached for her phone, no doubt to call her husband, but I was already walking toward the door. "Oh," and Karen, I turned back. "The HOA meeting tonight is going to be very interesting. You might want to bring your lawyer." As I left the office, I could hear her frantically dialing numbers, but it was too late. The evidence was already in the hands of the district attorney, and copies had been sent to every HOA board member's email. My mother's roses might be gone, but justice was about to bloom in their place. I looked at my watch. 6 hours until the HOA meeting. 6 hours until Karen realized what it felt like to watch everything she built crumble right in front of her. And this time, the whole neighborhood would be there to witness it. I walked into City Hall that evening, carrying a briefcase filled with evidence and a determination stronger than ever. This wasn't just about my mother's home anymore. It was about every family Karen and her corrupt HOA had bullied, every homeowner who had been pushed out for the sake of profit. The council chamber was packed, the tension in the room thick. News cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking as they captured everything. Karen sat in the front row, wearing a sharp suit, her usual smug smile plastered on her face. She even had the nerve to wave at me. "Last week, I began, my voice steady. Many of you watched as bulldozers tore down my mother's home, a house she had lived in for 40 years. The HOA claimed it was an emergency demolition for safety reasons." I paused, letting my words settle over the crowd. "Tonight, I'm going to show you what really happened." The first slide appeared on the screen behind me. Property maps from before the HOA was even established. Sarah stood up from the council table and began passing out copies. I pointed at the boundary lines. "Notice this area. The HOA's jurisdiction ends exactly 3.5 feet before where they started demolition. That means every inch of what they did was illegal." Murmurs spread across the room. Karen's husband shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but I wasn't done. "Now let's talk about Golden Parking Solutions," I continued, clicking to the next slide. "The company that was set to develop the parking lot where my mother's house once stood. Interesting how it is owned by none other than Thomas Whitfield, Karen's husband." The whispers in the room turned into full-blown outrage. The HOA board members exchanged nervous glances, some already inching away from Karen. "But wait," I said, raising my voice slightly, "it gets worse." I pulled out a stack of violation notices, hundreds of them, issued to homeowners across the neighborhood. Every single one of these properties was pressured to sell, and guess who bought them through shell companies? The chamber erupted in shocked gasps. I could see faces in the audience. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lost her garden last year, Mr. Peterson, who had been forced to sell his family home. People who had suffered because of Karen's greed. That was when Karen made her biggest mistake. She shot up from her seat, her voice shrill. "This is a witch hunt. You're just mad about your mother's worthless old house." The room fell into a stunned silence. I let a small smile form. "Thank you, Karen, for that outburst, because now I would like to introduce something very special." I nodded at Sarah, who pressed play on an audio recording. Karen's own voice filled the room, detailing secret kickbacks, illegal property deals, and her plan to force homeowners out. The next few minutes were chaos. HOA board members scrambled to distance themselves. Some even started confessing right then and there. Karen's husband tried to slip out the door, but found 2 uniformed officers waiting for him. Turns out fraud across state lines is a federal offense. I saved the best for last. As mayor of this city, I am invoking Emergency Order 47B, effective immediately, freezing all HOA assets pending investigation. I turned to Karen, looking her directly in the eye. "And I am establishing a victims' compensation fund from those very same assets." The vote was unanimous. Karen was led out of the chamber in handcuffs, still screaming about her rights. Her husband was already on the phone with his lawyer. The other board members looked like ghosts. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of justice. The real victory, though, came after the meeting, when my mother walked into the chamber, clutching the only family photo she had managed to save. The entire room stood up in silent respect. She pulled me into a hug, whispering, "You did good, baby. You did good." I almost dropped my coffee mug when my mother called me at dawn. "Sweetie, you need to see this," she said, her voice filled with disbelief. I rushed over to find Karen standing at the edge of our new property line, fuming as a construction crew ripped apart the foundation of her so-called parking project. The look on her face was worth every sleepless night I had spent exposing her. The past year had been a whirlwind of legal battles and unexpected victories, each one sweeter than the last. After the city council stripped the HOA of its power, we discovered even more corruption in Karen's operation. Turns out, she had been running similar schemes in 3 other neighborhoods, using her husband's company to force elderly residents out of their homes. When the FBI got involved, they followed the money trail straight to offshore accounts linked to Karen and her husband. I still remember the day we broke ground on my mother's new home. The whole neighborhood showed up with shovels and smiles, even Mrs. Rodriguez, who rarely left her house. Sarah organized a potluck, and someone started a fundraiser for all the families Karen had hurt. The local news couldn't get enough of the story. Corrupt HOA meets its downfall, and Mayor Mom became their favorite headline. The new house took shape slowly, but we made sure to do it right. My mother wanted the same layout as her old home, but I added some upgrades. Wider doorways for her walker, a first-floor bedroom, and a security system. The garden was expanded with a special area dedicated to my father's favorite flowers. Every morning, she sits in her new sunroom, drinking tea and watching her roses grow taller than Karen's old ruler could ever measure. Last week, during the housewarming party, little Tommy from next door asked why so many people were crying happy tears. I told him sometimes justice takes time, but it's always worth fighting for. The community garden, where Karen's parking lot was supposed to be, is now thriving with vegetables and flowers. It is managed by a group of residents who genuinely care about their neighborhood. We even named it the Thompson Memorial Garden. My father would have loved seeing children learning how to grow their own food there. Karen's empire collapsed faster than anyone expected. Her husband filed for divorce the moment the scandal hit the papers, taking what little money was left and running off to Florida with his secretary. The last time anyone saw Karen, she was loading a moving truck in the middle of the night, trying to avoid reporters camped outside her house. Karma has a way of catching up to people like her. The best part came yesterday when I signed the new Homeowner Protection Act into law. Sarah helped me draft it, making sure no HOA in our city could ever pull a stunt like this again. We added special protections for elderly residents and strict oversight rules for any major property decisions. My mother sat in the front row during the signing ceremony, wearing my father's favorite sweater and smiling with pride. This morning, as I helped her plant new roses along the front walkway, she pulled out an old photo album. Inside was a picture of me at 8 years old, wearing my father's oversized suit jacket, pretending to give speeches from our porch. "You always said you wanted to help people," she smiled, wiping away a tear. "Your father would be so proud of how you did it." The neighborhood feels different now. People wave and stop to chat instead of hiding behind their blinds. Mrs. Rodriguez brings my mother homemade tamales every Sunday, and the Chin family's kids help maintain the community garden. Even some former HOA board members admitted they were wrong and now volunteer for monthly neighborhood cleanup days. Sitting in my mother's new kitchen, watching her hum my father's favorite song while baking cookies for the neighborhood children, I can't help but think about how close we came to losing everything. But sometimes, the worst moments in life lead to the best changes. The framed newspaper article on my mother's wall says it all. Local mayor turns personal tragedy into community triumph. Today, I am heading to a national mayor's conference to share our story and help other cities protect their residents from HOA abuse. My mother insists on coming along, saying she has a new mission: to be the voice for those too scared to speak up. Looking at her now, arranging cookies on a plate and going over her speech, I see the same strength that got us through this past year. Karen might have destroyed our old house, but in doing so, she helped us build something stronger, a real community. The past few months have been a whirlwind. After Karen's arrest, investigators uncovered even more about her corruption. She had been running similar schemes for years, pushing out long-term homeowners and replacing them with developments that lined her pockets. Several city officials were implicated in the scandal, and soon, indictments started rolling in. The legal battle was long, but it ended with Karen and her husband losing everything. Their assets were seized, their reputation shattered. Karen tried to fight back, filing appeal after appeal, but nothing could change the truth. The evidence was undeniable. I still remember the day we finalized my mother's home rebuild. The entire community came together to celebrate, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt united. People who had once been afraid of speaking out against the HOA were now leading the charge for positive change. The Homeowner Protection Act became a model for other cities, and soon, mayors from across the country started reaching out to learn how they could protect their residents from similar corruption. My mother's resilience inspired people far beyond our town. She began speaking at local events, advocating for homeowner rights, and warning others about the dangers of unchecked HOA power. She became a symbol of strength, a reminder that one voice, no matter how small, can spark a movement. The neighborhood has changed in ways I never expected. The empty lots Karen had planned to turn into a parking complex are now filled with gardens, walking paths, and community spaces. The residents who once lived in fear of the HOA's wrath now gather for weekend events, organizing neighborhood cleanups and supporting one another. The scars Karen left behind will always remain, but we've turned them into something meaningful. Last week, my mother and I walked through the Thompson Memorial Garden, watching children plant flowers where Karen's office once stood. She turned to me with a smile, squeezing my hand. "You didn't just win a battle," she said softly. "You changed lives." Sitting here now, preparing to address an audience of city leaders, I know she's right. This fight was never just about one home or one corrupt HOA. It was about standing up to greed and proving that justice can still prevail. The framed newspaper article in my mother's kitchen serves as a reminder of how far we've come. The headline reads, "Local Mayor Dismantles Corrupt HOA Empire." But to me, the real victory is the sense of peace in my mother's eyes and the laughter of children playing outside where fear once lived. Some battles are worth fighting, and this was one of them. The framed newspaper article on my mother's wall says it all. Local mayor dismantles corrupt HOA empire. But for me, the real victory is seeing her at peace. The past year has been a journey, one filled with battles, but also with moments of triumph that proved justice is worth fighting for. After the dust settled, Karen's case became a warning for HOAs across the country. More homeowners came forward, revealing how they had been pressured, fined, and forced out of their homes. Investigations expanded beyond our town, exposing similar corrupt practices in multiple states. The FBI and federal authorities took over, and soon, what started as a neighborhood scandal turned into a national case of fraud and abuse of power. Karen's name became synonymous with greed, her once influential connections abandoning her one by one. She tried to fight back, but without money, power, or support, she had nowhere to turn. The last I heard, she had moved to a rundown apartment in another state, far from the lavish lifestyle she once enjoyed. My mother, on the other hand, found a new purpose. She dedicated her time to helping families who had suffered under unfair HOAs, speaking at local events and working with advocacy groups to push for stricter regulations. The Homeowner Protection Act, once just an idea, became law, ensuring no HOA could ever abuse its power again. Cities across the country started adopting similar policies, and for the first time in a long time, homeowners felt safe in their own neighborhoods. The community transformed as well. The area where Karen's parking lot was supposed to be is now a thriving green space, with walking paths and gardens that bring neighbors together. Instead of fear and frustration, there is now a sense of unity. People no longer avoid each other, afraid of HOA fines or complaints. They talk, they help, they rebuild. Last weekend, as I walked through the neighborhood, I saw families gathered in the community garden, tending to the plants where Karen's office once stood. Children played where there used to be tension. My mother sat on a bench, watching the scene with a peaceful smile. "This is how it should have always been," she said. I nodded, knowing she was right. The battles we fought, the sleepless nights, the struggle, it all led to this moment, where an entire community had reclaimed their homes, their rights, and their dignity. Some fights are bigger than a single house or a single person. This was one of them. The morning air felt different as I sat with my mother on the front porch of her new home, sipping tea and watching the sunrise. For the first time in a long while, there was no tension, no fear of another violation notice, no threat hanging over our heads. Just peace. The neighborhood had changed in more ways than one. People now gathered freely, children played without worry, and homeowners who had once lived in fear of unfair fines now felt safe in their own homes. The HOA was officially dismantled, and the community had taken back control of their neighborhood. The headlines had moved on, the reporters had stopped calling, but for the people who lived here, the impact of what happened would never fade. Karen's downfall had set a precedent, making sure no other HOA could abuse its power the way she had. The Homeowner Protection Act had been adopted in multiple cities, and cases like my mother's were now being used to fight corruption elsewhere. What had started as one family's nightmare had turned into a movement that changed lives across the country. As for Karen, she had become nothing more than a cautionary tale. The last I heard, she was still tangled in legal battles, trying desperately to avoid a prison sentence. Her once powerful connections had abandoned her, and the luxurious life she had built off other people's suffering had crumbled. There were no more designer suits, no expensive homes, no champagne celebrations. Just the cold reality of the consequences she had tried so hard to escape. My mother looked over at me, smiling as she patted my hand. "You know," she said softly, "your father would have been so proud of you." I swallowed the lump in my throat, nodding as I took in the sight of our rebuilt home, the garden blooming once more. He would have loved to see this. The neighborhood, once divided by fear, was now stronger than ever. People helped each other, looking out for their neighbors the way a real community should. The land where Karen had planned her parking complex was now a park, filled with benches and flowers planted by the very people she had tried to push out. It was proof that greed could be beaten, that justice could win, and that a home was more than just a structure. It was the heart of a family, something no one had the right to take away. I stood up, stretching as I looked around. The fight had been long and exhausting, but standing there in the warmth of the morning sun, I knew it had all been worth it. My mother had her home back, my community had its voice, and Karen had finally faced the consequences of her actions. Some battles are won in courtrooms, others in board meetings, but the most important ones are fought with resilience, determination, and the belief that no one should have the power to take away what rightfully belongs to another. And as I looked at my mother, her hands gently tending to the roses my father had once planted, I knew one thing for certain. This was the kind of victory that would last for generations.